Hank Miller, a man who had long since hung up his uniform, stepped into the airport terminal carrying a small, unassuming wooden box. The urn inside held the remains of Private First Class Jeremy Knox, a young man who had tragically lost his life in a training accident at Camp Pendleton. Hank, an Army veteran, wasn't here for any grand ceremony or fanfare. He wasn't even wearing his old military uniform, just a faded flannel shirt, worn jeans, and a cap that bore the insignia of his own military service. But in his heart, he carried a promise that was far more important than any medal or recognition. Hank had promised Jeremy's father, a dear friend and fellow soldier, that if anything ever happened to Jeremy, Hank would bring him home. It was a promise made in the heat of battle, one of the many promises soldiers make to each other, knowing the weight they carry. A promise made to a brother-in-arms who couldn't be there for his son's final farewell. It was a promise that, for Hank, transcended everything, even the passing of time. Despite the circumstances, there was no flag-draped coffin, no military procession. Jeremy's death wasn't from combat, and there would be no national ceremony in his honor. No, this was just a tragic accident, one that left a family heartbroken and a promise unfulfilled. But Hank wasn't going to let it go. He was determined to keep his word, no matter how humble or quiet the task. To him, it wasn't about ceremony. It was about honoring the bond of brotherhood and the weight of a soldier's word. And so, Hank Miller boarded a flight from Denver to Philadelphia, carrying Jeremy's ashes, silently fulfilling a promise that had been made in the midst of war, long before the accident. He knew that, for Jeremy's family, this was more than just a return home. It was the completion of a promise, an act of love and respect that only someone who had experienced the camaraderie of war could truly understand. The urn in Hank's hands wasn't just a box. It was a testament to his commitment, a symbol of a soldier's promise that could never be broken. No ceremony, no recognition, but for Hank Miller, this was everything. And as he carried it forward, he knew this was a mission that would not go unnoticed, even if no one else could see it. Hank Miller shuffled through the bustling terminals of Chicago O'Hare Airport, the sound of footsteps echoing in the cold, sterile space. The usual airport noise was amplified by the occasional announcement and the hum of air conditioning. But to Hank, it felt as if the world around him had faded into the background. All that mattered was the small wooden box in his hands. The urn containing the remains of Private First Class Jeremy Knox. It had been a long journey. His flight from Denver had already been delayed, and now, here at the gate in Chicago, Hank could feel his patience wearing thin. His knees ached from sitting for too long, and his back was stiff from the uncomfortable plastic seats. Yet, despite the discomfort, he never let go of the urn. His grip was tight but steady, as if he were holding onto a lifeline, a promise made to a dying friend. The urn, so small yet so heavy with significance, was all he had left of Jeremy, and Hank wasn't going to let anything or anyone take that from him. As the gate agent called for boarding, Hank took a deep breath, knowing what he had to do. The plan was simple. Get the urn onto the plane first, make sure it was safely stowed, and then he could relax. He had already endured the long hours of waiting and the frustrations of delays. The last thing he wanted now was to watch Jeremy's remains handled like a piece of luggage. He stepped forward, waiting for a moment when the line had thinned, and approached the counter. The gate agent, a young woman who looked as if she had been on her feet for hours, was busy typing away on her computer, her eyes never leaving the screen. Hank hesitated for a second, the silence stretching between them. Then, gently, he spoke. "Excuse me," Hank began, his voice hoarse but firm. I'm traveling with a fallen soldier, Private First Class Jeremy Knox. I need to make sure his remains are boarded safely." The agent didn't even look up. Her fingers continued to tap the keys, her gaze fixed on the computer monitor. Finally, she let out a tired sigh and spoke without so much as a glance in his direction. "We can't delay boarding for a box, sir. All passengers board according to group number," she said flatly. Her voice indifferent. Hank's heart sank, a wave of disbelief sweeping over him. He had expected a little more, some empathy, maybe a hint of respect. But the gate agent's words were like a slap in the face. No compassion, no understanding, just policy. His grip on the urn tightened slightly, but he didn't raise his voice. Instead, he spoke with quiet conviction. "This isn't just any box. It's a Marine, a fallen Marine. I'm asking if I can board first. I need to make sure he gets on the plane safely." The agent's response came quickly, and it was cold, almost robotic. "It's just an urn, sir. We don't make exceptions for ashes. Group 1 is boarding now. You'll need to step aside." Hank stood there for a moment, stunned by the dismissive tone. He glanced around, expecting to see someone step in, to hear a murmur of support, but the passengers around him continued on with their own business, indifferent to his quiet plea. A teenager nearby snickered, nudging his friend. An executive in a tailored suit checked his watch impatiently, clearly annoyed by the delay. A mother hushed her child as they passed by. No one said anything. No one cared. Hank felt a wave of frustration swell within him, but he forced himself to swallow it. He wasn't here for a confrontation. He wasn't here to make a scene. His entire life had been about doing the right thing, no matter how hard it was, no matter how many times the world turned its back on him. The way he had been treated upon his return from Vietnam still haunted him, and he refused to let his anger get the best of him now that he stepped back from the counter, feeling the weight of the urn pulling on his arms like a heavy anchor. A lump formed in his throat, but he didn't let it show. He walked over to a nearby seat, choosing one by the window. He needed to watch the plane, to know that it was ready to carry Jeremy home. His fingers curled slightly, as if still holding the rifle he had carried decades ago. The passengers continued boarding, each one brushing past him without a second thought. He could feel the eyes of others on him, but none of them spoke up. A woman in a business suit leaned toward her companion and whispered, "I think that's a funeral. Shouldn't someone say something?" Her friend shrugged, uncomfortable, and said nothing. Hank's gaze never wavered from the plane outside the window. The plane that would carry Jeremy's remains. The one that would finally take him back to the family who had lost him. He whispered to the urn, as if speaking directly to the fallen soldier. "Almost home, kid," he murmured. "Your dad's waiting. Your mom too. Got a whole neighborhood ready to welcome you." A text message pinged on his phone, and Hank's thumb moved over the screen with deliberate slowness. "Any updates, Mike?" The message read. Hank's finger hovered over the keyboard, and then he typed back, "Boarding soon. We'll call when we land." At that moment, Hank felt the sting of isolation more deeply than ever. The empty space around him was a constant reminder of the lack of respect. But what hurt the most was not the silence of the room, it was the absence of humanity. As passengers filed past him, they didn't see the man sitting there with a promise fulfilled. They only saw an old man with a box. Just as he was beginning to feel the full weight of the moment, a voice broke through the stillness. A man, sharply dressed in a military uniform, approached Hank. His polished shoes clicked sharply on the terminal floor, and there was no hesitation in his movement. His presence was commanding. "Private Knox?" the man asked softly, his voice pitched only for Hank to hear. Hank looked up, surprised that anyone knew the name. "Yes, sir," Hank replied, his voice steady but filled with an unspoken sadness. The man studied him for a moment, then nodded in recognition. He extended his hand. "I'm General Marcus Raburn, retired. I'll be escorting you." For the first time since he arrived, Hank felt a flicker of hope. General Marcus Raburn had seen it all. Decades of service, 3 wars, countless battles, and endless missions. Yet, there was something in the air tonight that unsettled him. A subtle shift in the weight of the world. Something he couldn't ignore. He'd been sitting near the gate, a few rows behind Hank Miller, quietly observing the scene unfolding before him. Raburn had noticed the old man, the military cap, the urn. But what truly caught his attention was the profound disrespect that Hank was receiving. An injustice he could not stand by and watched as Hank stood there, quietly asking for the urn to be boarded first. The gate agent's indifference had struck a chord deep within Raburn. He knew that feeling too well, the frustration of seeing a fellow soldier dismissed, the sting of being ignored, of watching someone who had given so much be treated like an afterthought. And then, there it was. The young agent's response, dismissive, cold, as though the urn, the fallen soldier's remains, were just another piece of luggage. It was in that moment, as Hank stepped back and quietly walked toward an empty seat, that Raburn's resolve hardened. He could feel the anger rising within him, not for himself, but for the silent injustice happening before his eyes. No one else seemed to care. The passengers, the agents, the crowd, all oblivious, indifferent, going about their business as if this wasn't a moment that demanded something more, something beyond routine. But for Raburn, this was not just a duty. This was a matter of honor. Raburn's military instincts kicked in. He had fought in battles where the stakes were high, where lives were on the line, but this was different. This wasn't just about orders or rank. This was about respect. Respect for the fallen. Respect for the promises made between soldiers. Respect for a man who had carried out his duty with the quiet dignity of a true warrior. Raburn knew that in moments like these, the right thing to do wasn't always the loudest thing. It was the firm, unwavering action that spoke volumes. He stood up from his seat with deliberate calmness, his polished shoes clicking sharply on the terminal floor. His movements were fluid, purposeful, every step measured, every motion precise. His eyes locked onto the gate agent, and the slight shift in his posture signaled that he was no longer a bystander. He was stepping into the role he had been trained for, leadership in action. "Excuse me," Raburn said, his voice low but commanding, as he approached the counter. His gaze never wavered from the agent, his presence alone cutting through the static noise of the terminal. The gate agent barely looked up, her fingers still typing on the keyboard, her focus on the screen as if her world had become nothing more than a list of boarding groups. "Sir, I can assist you after we complete boarding," the agent replied, her tone still dismissive, though she now seemed slightly uncomfortable under the weight of Raburn's unwavering stare. "That's not a request, young lady." Raburn's voice remained steady, but there was a steel edge to it now. The kind of edge that came from decades of commanding respect, of leading men and women into the unknown and coming back victorious. The agent looked up, startled by his authority, but before she could speak, Raburn continued. "That man," he gestured towards Hank, still sitting quietly with the urn in his hands, "is not just carrying luggage. He is performing a military escort. A promise made to a fallen brother. A mission that does not stop at the airport gates. You will not treat him like another passenger. You will honor him, and you will honor his mission." The words hit like a thunderclap. The terminal, which had been buzzing with the usual distractions of travelers and announcements, suddenly seemed to pause. Raburn's voice had a gravity to it, one that commanded attention. The agent's fingers froze mid-air above her keyboard, her expression shifting from indifference to shock. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. She was taken aback by the force of Raburn's words, by the unspoken weight of the moment. "I'm familiar with your airline's policy on military remains," Raburn continued, his voice calm but unyielding. "Section 4, paragraph 3 clearly provides for dignity and precedence in these matters. I suggest you review it." The gate agent's face blanched as she scrambled to check the policy. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, her eyes wide as she pulled up the document. Raburn knew it would take only a moment for her to realize her mistake. It wasn't that she didn't know the policy. It was that she hadn't cared enough to apply it. But now, she had no choice but to face the consequences of her apathy. I wasn't aware," she stammered, her voice faltering. "Of course you weren't," Raburn said, his voice now softened with an edge of pity. "But now you are." He turned away from the counter, his gaze sweeping the terminal. It was as though the air around him had shifted. His command presence was undeniable, and the people in uniform, scattered throughout the terminal, began to sense the change. Raburn's eyes scanned the area, and without hesitation, he raised his voice just enough for everyone to hear. "Attention!" It was one word, but it carried the weight of 1,000 commands. It was a voice trained to demand action, to unite a group with a single directive. Heads turned immediately. Every soldier, every airman, every marine, every sailor in uniform snapped to attention, their bodies straightening as if by instinct. Some who had been boarding paused. Others who had been on their phones stopped mid-sentence, their training kicking in without a second thought. A young female lieutenant set down her coffee, and a grizzled master sergeant cut off his conversation. The change was palpable. The entire terminal seemed to hold its breath as military personnel from all corners of the airport began to gather. They lined up in 2 silent rows, forming an impromptu honor guard, and the atmosphere transformed. It was no longer an airport filled with impatient travelers and indifferent gate agents. Now it was a place of reverence, a place where duty, honor, and respect were restored in a single unified act. Hank, still seated by the window, looked up in quiet surprise. He saw the rows of soldiers, standing at attention, a silent tribute to the fallen. His heart stirred with a mix of disbelief and gratitude. The honor that had been denied to him just moments before was now unfolding before his eyes. And it was no longer just about him. It was about Jeremy. It was about a promise fulfilled, and about the respect that every soldier, every human being, deserved. General Raburn turned to Hank, his voice softening, and with a simple gesture, extended his hand. "Private First Class Knox deserves an escort to his final flight home," he said, his voice steady but filled with quiet admiration. "We'd be honored to provide it." The atmosphere in the terminal shifted instantly, as if the very air had thickened with purpose. General Marcus Raburn's command was simple yet powerful, and it cut through the tension like a hot knife through butter. "Attention!" The word echoed through the bustling hub of Chicago O'Hare, sharp and commanding. And in that moment, everything else, the hurried footsteps of travelers, the clattering of rolling suitcases, the chatter of voices, came to an abrupt, almost eerie halt. It was as if time itself paused, a collective breath held in anticipation. All around him, military personnel, who had been scattered throughout the terminal, stopped what they were doing. A man in a camouflage jacket who had been sitting with his phone in hand straightened up, his hand instinctively going to his side in a crisp salute. A group of National Guard members who had been milling about at a nearby gate snapped into formation, their bodies rigid with discipline. Even the airmen who had been chatting in a corner dropped their casual postures. Standing at attention with perfect synchronization, a row of uniformed soldiers began to emerge from every direction, forming 2 distinct lines that stretched the length of the terminal. With each step, their boots clicked with sharp precision against the polished tile, and their movements flowed seamlessly, as if they were an extension of the same heartbeat. The sight was striking, a living honor guard forming in the middle of the airport, completely unscripted, unplanned, and yet so perfectly executed that it was impossible not to feel its weight. Hank Miller, still seated by the window, had his eyes trained on the formation. His heart raced as he slowly processed what was happening. He had been an observer of history before, but this was something else. The men and women in uniform didn't just stand in lines. They stood with purpose, with a sense of belonging, as though they were there for something much bigger than themselves. And that something was Hank, the promise he had made, and the fallen soldier in his hands. For a long moment, Hank remained still, not knowing whether to stand, to say something, or simply to breathe in the honor being bestowed upon him and his mission. His fingers curled protectively around the urn, as if to shield Jeremy one last time. But this time, it was different. He wasn't alone. The solemnity of the moment engulfed him, and as his eyes scanned the rows of soldiers, a quiet sense of peace began to settle in his chest. They were there with him. The promise was being fulfilled, and now it was not just his to carry. The silence in the terminal was thick, heavy with the shared reverence of the military personnel who had gathered. As they stood in perfect alignment, it was as though they formed a wall of protection, not just for the urn, but for Hank's mission. A mission that had begun so quietly, with only a promise between two soldiers, but was now blossoming into something that moved the very heart of everyone who witnessed it. That Hank's attention was drawn to the other passengers, whose reactions varied, but all seemed to carry an undercurrent of something profound. The business travelers, who moments ago had been impatiently checking their watches or tapping away on their phones, now sat back, their expressions shifting. The suited man who had been staring at his watch nervously now sat still, his eyes not on his watch, but on the honor guard that stretched before him. A woman who had been making a hurried call to her friend slowly lowered the phone, her voice trembling slightly as she whispered, "Is this a funeral?" Beside her, a teenage boy who had been snickering moments earlier at the sight of Hank was now standing completely still, his gaze wide and full of wonder, as if the full weight of the moment had just hit him. There was no laughter now, no sneers. The coldness of indifference had melted away, replaced by something much more profound, respect. And for the first time in the young boy's life, perhaps, he understood the true meaning of honor. At the front of the formation, General Raburn stood tall, his posture unyielding. His eyes scanned the rows of military personnel, nodding with satisfaction as they snapped to attention with military precision. It wasn't a spectacle. It wasn't about showing off. It was a silent, collective tribute to something far greater than any individual soldier or officer. This was about the silent bond that tied them all together, the shared understanding of duty, sacrifice, and brotherhood. Raburn turned back to Hank, his voice lowered but still firm. "Mr. Miller," he said, extending his hand, "would you do us the honor of walking with us?" Hank looked up, his eyes wide with disbelief, but there was no hesitation in his heart. He had been the one carrying the weight all this time, the only one who had known the true gravity of his promise. But now, as the soldiers in uniform saluted him, as the passengers around him held their breath, he felt the weight of it lift, if only for a moment. This wasn't just his promise anymore. It was a promise that had become a shared mission, a collective duty. Hank slowly stood up from his seat, the urn held carefully in his hands. His legs trembled slightly as he rose, not from fear, but from the intensity of the moment. The honor guard parted, their eyes locked in respectful salutes, creating a path for him. Each step he took toward the formation felt like the unfolding of something sacred, something larger than life. The click of his boots on the terminal floor seemed to sync with the rhythm of the soldiers around him. As Hank walked forward, his hands still resting on the urn, he could feel the weight of every salute, the pressure of every respectful gaze. It wasn't for him, not really. It was for Jeremy, for the promise, for the honor of those who had served and fallen. And with every step, Hank realized that the mission was no longer just about carrying Jeremy home. It was about the legacy of service, of sacrifice, and the profound respect that came with it. The passengers, still observing, remained quiet, some with heads bowed, others with tears in their eyes. This wasn't just an honor for Hank. It was an honor for every soldier, every person who had ever stood with them in silence, in service, and in respect. And for the first time, Hank Miller truly understood the power of a promise kept, not just in words but in actions, in the salute of a brother in arms, in the reverence of an entire room. The mission continued. The cabin was quiet, too quiet. Hank Miller sat in his seat, the urn cradled securely in his hands, as the aircraft soared through the night sky. The usual hum of a flight, the clink of trays, the chatter of passengers, was absent, replaced by a hushed reverence that hung heavy in the air. It wasn't just the empty seats beside him or the long silence from the passengers. It was the weight of the moment, the journey that had just begun. Hank was no stranger to flying, but this flight was unlike any he had ever taken. This wasn't a routine business trip or a vacation getaway. This was something deeply personal, something that transcended the typical noise of the modern world. Every part of Hank's being was attuned to the small urn in his hands, the fragile container holding the remains of Private First Class Jeremy Knox. Jeremy, a young man he had promised to bring home, was now bound for his final resting place as the flight continued. Hank noticed something remarkable. The passengers, many of whom had been restless and impatient during the boarding process, now sat in quiet contemplation. There were no loud conversations, no clattering of food trays or the murmur of casual chatter. In fact, several passengers had silently risen from their seats to stand, heads bowed, their hands pressed to their chests in an unspoken tribute. Others, their faces lined with emotion, quietly prayed, their eyes closed, their lips barely moving in soft words of respect. Hank couldn't help but notice a businessman, who had been so impatient earlier, now standing with his hand over his heart. His sharp suit looked out of place in the quiet, somber atmosphere, but his posture, rigid with respect, spoke volumes. A young woman, her face streaked with tears, sat by the window, staring out into the darkness of the night sky, her hands clasped tightly together. She wasn't alone in her grief. It seemed as though the entire plane had joined her in the act of remembrance. It wasn't just the passengers. The flight attendants, too, seemed to recognize the gravity of the situation. One by one, they came to Hank's side, offering him water, a blanket, or anything else he might need. They moved with a kind of reverence, their actions gentle, their words soft and respectful. Each time they checked on him, they spoke in hushed tones, as though not wanting to disturb the solemnity of the moment. Their presence was comforting, a reminder that Hank wasn't alone in this as the flight stretched on. Hank couldn't help but feel a wave of emotion wash over him. He had never expected this kind of reaction, this outpouring of respect. The attention, the deference, the shared understanding among strangers. It was overwhelming. He had carried this promise for so long, had made this journey so many times in his mind, but he had never imagined it would be met with such dignity. Then, something truly unexpected happened. The first-class passenger who had been sitting near Hank, a man with neatly combed hair and a neatly pressed suit, stood up. He approached Hank with a glass of whiskey in his hand, the amber liquid swirling gently inside the glass. Hank looked up, puzzled, but the man said nothing. He simply extended the glass toward him. The gesture was silent, but the message was clear. The man's voice was steady, though his eyes betrayed a deep emotion. "I thought you might need this," he said, his words thick with the weight of what they both understood. "This is for the fallen." Hank, moved by the unexpected kindness, stared at the glass for a moment, then looked back at the man, who gave him a respectful nod. Without saying a word, Hank took the glass and placed it gently beside him. He didn't drink it. He didn't need to. It wasn't the whiskey that mattered. It was the recognition, the gesture of respect that meant more than any words could convey. That as the flight progressed, the atmosphere on board became even more still. Hank could feel the collective breath of the passengers, an unspoken acknowledgement of what was happening, of what this flight truly represented. It wasn't just the ashes of a fallen soldier being transported. It was a tribute to the sacrifices made, to the promises kept, to the duty that soldiers like Hank and Jeremy carried with them every day. The journey seemed to pass in slow motion. Hank lost track of time. His mind focused solely on the urn in his hands and the miles that were ticking away, bringing Jeremy closer to home. His thoughts drifted to Jeremy's father, Mike, and how he would feel when he finally received the call that his son was back. The weight of that final conversation, the promise he had made, seemed to settle deeper into Hank's chest. Then, the plane began its descent, and the moment Hank had been dreading, but also anticipating, arrived. The seatbelt sign flickered on, and the captain's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we will be landing shortly. Please make sure your seatbelts are fastened and your tray tables are up." Hank felt a stirring inside him, a mix of nervousness and resolve. This was it, the final leg of the journey. He had kept his promise. Now, it was time to bring Jeremy home. That as the plane touched down on the tarmac, there was no loud cheer from the passengers, no clapping as there sometimes is after a smooth flight. Instead, the cabin remained still, the silence pressing in on Hank like a tangible thing. The crew moved swiftly, but gently, making preparations for the disembarkation. They were calm, collected, but the undercurrent of respect was palpable. When the plane came to a full stop, the door opened, and the flight attendants moved toward Hank. One of them leaned in and whispered, "Mr. Miller, we're going to escort you off the plane first. Thank you for allowing us to be part of this journey." Hank nodded, his throat tight with emotion. The gesture was small, but it was everything. As he stood up, the aisle seemed to clear. The passengers who had been seated in the cabin watched quietly, some wiping their eyes, some simply nodding in silent acknowledgement. Hank walked down the aisle with slow, deliberate steps, the urn still gently in his arms. The moment felt like an eternity. As he reached the door, he was met with a different kind of welcome. Military personnel stood at attention, lined up along the jetway, their faces somber and filled with gratitude. The airport staff, too, had gathered, forming a human corridor. Saluting Hank as he passed out, it was a salute not just for Hank, but for the promise, for the fallen, and for the shared bond of brotherhood that transcended everything. As Hank walked past them, his chest swelled with pride, with humility, and with the understanding that this moment, this journey, was far more than he had ever imagined. It was a tribute not just to Jeremy, but to every soldier who had ever given everything for their country. And as he stepped off the plane, Hank knew that the promise had been fulfilled. Jeremy was finally home. Hank Miller's journey didn't end when he stepped off the plane. It didn't end when the salute was made, when the airport personnel formed lines to honor him, or when the door to the plane closed behind him. No, Hank's journey had only just begun. But this time, it wasn't just about him or the fallen soldier in his arms. It was about the entire world witnessing the dignity, the reverence, and the respect that should be shown to every soldier's remains. And as the days passed, Hank's story spread like wildfire, capturing hearts and sparking conversations across the globe. It began with a video. A few passengers, moved by the unspoken tribute that had unfolded in front of them, had filmed Hank's procession, recording the moment that the military personnel had stepped in to form an honor guard. The video quickly made its way to social media, and within hours it had gone viral. Thousands of comments poured in from people around the world, expressing gratitude, admiration, and disbelief at the simple yet profound act of respect that had been demonstrated. The story spread across news outlets, both local and national, and before long, it reached the corporate headquarters of the airline involved in the incident. The backlash was immediate and powerful. People demanded answers. Why had the airline failed to honor Hank's request in the first place? Why had the airline's policy prevented a soldier from being treated with the dignity he deserved? For the first time, the airline was forced to confront the question of respect, not just for Hank, but for every fallen soldier. The public outcry was deafening. The airline's social media accounts were flooded with comments, many of them filled with anger, disappointment, and frustration. Travelers, veterans, and citizens alike all expressed their disbelief that such a thing had even happened. "How could you treat a soldier's remains this way?" One tweet read. "It's not just an urn. It's a promise. It's a sacrifice." Another stated, "The airline, shocked by the volume of the response, knew they had to act. They could no longer hide behind corporate policy. This was about something much larger than a business transaction. This was about values, about what it meant to honor those who had given everything. The airline's executives began an emergency meeting to address the situation, knowing that the only way to rebuild their reputation was to admit their mistake and make things right. The decision came swiftly. Within days, the airline announced a full policy change. They would no longer treat military remains as just another item to be processed. Military remains, regardless of how they were transported, would receive priority boarding, proper care, and, most importantly, respect. The announcement was made in a public statement, with the airline's CEO offering an apology for the oversight and a commitment to ensuring that no military family would ever face such an indignity again. "We deeply regret the oversight that occurred and apologize to Mr. Miller, the Knox family, and every service member and their families. Our priority will always be to honor the brave men and women who serve our country. We've updated our policies to ensure that all military remains are treated with the respect and dignity they deserve. No one will ever be left behind again," the statement read. But the changes didn't stop there. The airline wanted to make a statement that went beyond words. As a tribute to the service and sacrifice of every soldier, and in recognition of Hank Miller's quiet but powerful mission, the airline took a step that no one could have anticipated. They renamed the gate where the incident had occurred, Chicago O'Hare's Gate 25. The very gate where Hank had first been told his request could not be honored, was officially renamed Gate Honor. It was a symbolic move, one that served as a constant reminder of the respect that should be afforded to every soldier who traveled through the airport. The plaque was installed quickly, with the words engraved clearly, "In honor of those who serve." The ceremony was small, quiet, but deeply meaningful. The airline invited Hank to participate, though he was hesitant to accept. Hank wasn't one for public recognition. He never had been, but he understood the importance of what was happening. The airline wasn't just acknowledging their mistake. They were taking steps to ensure that something like this would never happen again. And that was something worth acknowledging. Hank attended the dedication ceremony at Gate Honor, but he was a man of few words. He simply stood there, alongside the airline's representatives and military personnel, his cap slightly askew, his weathered face betraying a mixture of pride and discomfort. The applause that followed the unveiling of the plaque was warm, sincere, and filled with respect. But Hank didn't need the applause. He didn't need the recognition. The only thing that mattered was that Jeremy was finally home as the plaque was revealed. The crowd fell silent. Hank stood before it, his eyes trained on the words. They weren't just words. They were a promise. They were a testament to the mission that had begun so quietly and had ended with an overwhelming wave of gratitude and respect. The plaque would remain at Gate Honor for as long as the airport stood, a silent yet powerful tribute to those who had given everything for their country. And as Hank left O'Hare that day, he knew that this was the last chapter of his journey. Not just for Jeremy, but for every soldier who would ever board a plane carrying the weight of their service. It wasn't about the recognition, it wasn't about the changes in policy, and it wasn't even about the plaque. It was about the promise he had kept, the brotherhood he had honored, and the respect that had been restored, not just to him, but to every soldier, past and present. Hank's story had been heard, and it had changed something big. And as the video continued to circulate, and as the airline's new policy was put into practice, the world would remember. They would remember Hank Miller, the promise he kept, and the soldiers who deserved to be treated with the respect they had earned. Hank Miller's journey didn't end at the Gate of O'Hare. And it didn't end when he delivered Jeremy's remains to his family. For Hank, the promise he had made to his old platoon buddy was just the beginning of something greater, something that transcended one soldier's mission. After that day, Hank became an active part of a network that would ensure no fallen soldier ever traveled alone again. His life became a testament to the power of respect, the weight of promises kept, and the importance of ensuring that those who served are never forgotten. Hank joined a veterans group, a dedicated collective of former service members who had come together with a single mission: to make sure that all military remains were escorted with the honor they deserved. The group worked tirelessly to organize volunteer escorts, providing them for any fallen soldier who required it, regardless of how far the journey was. Each escort was a solemn duty, but it was also a deep honor. As Hank stepped into this new role, he found himself surrounded by fellow veterans who shared his values. Men and women who, like him, understood the importance of brotherhood, sacrifice, and commitment. For Hank, the work wasn't just about fulfilling a promise to Jeremy. It was about making sure that every soldier, every fallen hero, received the recognition they had earned. It was about offering their families a sense of peace, knowing that their loved one's journey home would be honored by someone who understood the true cost of service. Hank was no longer just carrying a fallen soldier's remains. He was standing as a living, breathing embodiment of the respect that every veteran deserved. And every year, on the anniversary of Jeremy's return home, Hank made a pilgrimage to the cemetery where Jeremy was buried. He would stand before the grave, the urn now a part of the past, and pay his respects once more. But as he stood there, looking down at the stone that marked Jeremy's resting place, something remarkable happened. Hank began to notice that he wasn't alone. More and more people came to visit, and they weren't just veterans or military families. There were people from all walks of life, strangers who had heard about the story or who simply felt compelled to honor the sacrifice of a fallen soldier. It was heartening, and in a way, humbling. The cemetery was quiet, the wind gently rustling through the trees, and the sounds of the world outside seemed to fade away. Each year, more visitors came, and Hank, though a man of few words, would greet them with a nod, a silent acknowledgement of the shared respect that had brought them all to the same place. For Hank, this wasn't just about Jeremy anymore. It was about the countless others who had given their lives, the ones whose names may never make the headlines but whose sacrifices were just as vital. And it was about showing the next generation what it meant to respect the fallen. One particularly cold winter's day, Hank stood beside Jeremy's grave, his breath visible in the air, and looked out across the row of tombstones. A young man, probably no older than 20, approached him. He was wearing a faded military jacket, his eyes filled with quiet reverence. Hank had never seen him before, but there was something about the young man's expression that told him this wasn't just a casual visit. "Is this Private First Class Jeremy Knox's grave?" the young man asked quietly, his voice trembling ever so slightly. Hank nodded, his gaze softening. "Yes, it is. He's one of us." The young man stood there for a moment, his hand hovering over the stone. He didn't speak, but Hank could see the gratitude in his eyes. The young man wasn't just paying respects to a fallen soldier. He was connecting with the legacy that Hank and so many others had spent their lives upholding. The quiet strength of that moment resonated deeply with Hank, reminding him that the work he had done, the journey he had started, was something far larger than himself. It was about building a bridge of respect that would span generations, passing down the lessons of duty, sacrifice, and honor to those who would come after. Year after year, Hank continued his work with the veterans group, taking part in ceremonies, speaking at memorials, and organizing escort missions. But it was the quiet, personal moments, the ones when he stood alone with the urn or at the gravesite, that carried the deepest meaning for him. He would often find himself reflecting on how far this mission had taken him and how much further it still had to go. In those moments, Hank was more than just a veteran. He was a teacher. He was a living lesson on what it means to live with honor, to carry the weight of promises made, and to ensure that the sacrifices of others are never forgotten. Hank had lived through war, through loss, and through the darkness of those early years when it seemed like no one cared. But now he was part of something greater, a community that cared, a nation that remembered that as the years passed, Hank's story became a beacon for others. People reached out to him asking how they could help, how they could be part of the mission. And Hank, ever humble, would share his story, not as a tale of personal glory, but as an invitation to join in something bigger. He would always say, "It's not about me. It's about keeping the promise. It's about ensuring that no soldier is forgotten. No soldier should ever be left behind." And so the mission continued. Hank Miller, now an older man, continued to walk the path he had set for himself, not seeking recognition but knowing that his actions were making a difference in ways he could never fully see. But the respect he had fought for, the respect that had been built on his promise, was a legacy that would live on long after he was gone. If you believe that every soldier deserves to be honored, that every sacrifice deserves to be remembered, and that respect for those who serve should never fade, then join us in continuing this mission. Subscribe to our channel, share Hank's story, and be part of the movement to ensure that no soldier, no promise, and no sacrifice is ever forgotten. Together, we can keep the respect alive and ensure that the lessons of honor and duty are passed on to future generations.